Looking at the last Dante reading, last part of his On World Government, or De Monarchia. The first section of this reading, section 12. I can't say that I completely grasp Dante's logic here, and I'll explain why. But the first point he makes is actually quite a prominent part of sort of classical thinking, and I think is very valuable to keep in mind as we move through this course. Again, sort of anticipating modern political thought and how it differs from pre-modern political thinking. He says human freedom consists in being ruled by reason and in living for the goal of mankind. Such freedom is possible only under world government. The latter part of that, the conclusion, such freedom is only possible under world government, I don't see the logic of it, but the premise that human freedom consists in being ruled by reason is a very important idea, I think. We have this notion, I suppose, modern forms the idea of freedom. And freedom is the freedom to do what you want to do. And limitations on freedom are limitations on being able to do what you want to do. But I think like Dante, following Aristotle, following a whole tradition that transcends Aristotle, didn't think of freedom that way. Freedom for a thinker like Dante meant, as he says, being ruled by reason. And he has this very interesting point he makes. He's in the middle here. He's talking about making judgments. He says judgment lies between apprehension, thinking, and appetition, which is desire. For first, the thing is apprehended, understood. Like I see, I don't know, a book advertised on the internet. Then being apprehended is judged to be good or bad. And lastly, being judged is either sought or rejected. So I see the book on the internet and maybe I want it. Therefore, if the judgment completely dominates the appetite and is in no way prejudiced by appetite, it is free. That is, if I see the book on the internet and I think, do I need that book? Would it help me? Does it make sense to buy it? And what rule, the ruling motive is my thought as opposed to my desire. Oh, I just really want another book. Then I'm free. If it's my desire ruling me rather than my thought, then I'm not free. So Dante didn't think of freedom in terms of being able to do what you want to do. Dante thought freedom was kind of an internal thing. He thought that people who were dominated by their appetites, by their desires, were as unfree as you could be. It didn't matter their external situation. Which is, I don't know how this exactly leads to the second part here in section 12. Well, therefore, living under a world ruler is to be most free. I don't really see the connection, but that thought, I think, is very important to keep in mind, that real freedom consists in being rational, being ruled by one's intellect, one's rationality, one's thought, rather than by one's impulses and desires. Very, very strong thought in ancient philosophy. And then there is this idea that we would be most free under a world government, under a world ruler. Okay, see how it really follows. Maybe somebody can point it out to me from what he said before, but it's also interesting in its own sake, especially what he says. To be free means to exist for one's own sake and not for another's. That is, to be free means to exist for one's own sake and not for the sake of another. If you exist, let's say, like Aristotle's notion of slavery, the natural slave, it exists to serve its master. That person is clearly unfree. But if somebody exists for their own sake and not for the sake of another, they're free. And his point here is that people under a world government would exist most for their own sake. Now, this may be wrong. This may be a crazy idea, but this notion of existing for your own sake is actually another really important idea, which I think is carried over into, especially Enlightenment thinking, that all people exist for their own sake and need to be respected, and that we need to set up a form of government in which everyone's valued for their own sake. Like you're not valued because of necessarily what you contribute to the community. You're valued absolutely just because you're a human being. I think it's a really important idea here in Dante, and it may be in a different sort of context, but it's certainly another one to really, I think, keep in mind. Yeah, one of the things that I think is a continual issue in reading Dante is he has this idea of a world ruler, a world emperor, who would be at the head of a world government. And he argues repeatedly that this world emperor would be the most just ruler. And one of these things he says in section 13, he said earlier, an earlier reading, and that is because the world emperor would have nothing to strive for beyond what they already were. They would be less greedy and less prone to corruption than lesser rulers. Again, I think that if you think like an American or think like anybody who comes from a republic, like America is, of course there are other republics in the world, as opposed to a monarchy, then your thinking is very much opposed to this because you believe that, well, as Acton said, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that what we should always do in our constitutions is to limit the power of any one person or any one body, anyone, the separation of powers, which is in the absolute essence of the United States Constitution. Dante does not think like that. Dante thinks that the world ruler would be most just. And I suppose if you come from a republic, I think Dante did come from a republic, didn't he? Wasn't Florence a republic when Dante was alive? I don't know. But you're very suspicious of anybody having that kind of absolute power. But Dante thinks that that would be the best for everybody, I don't know. Therefore, the world ruler can best govern others, hence it follows that for the best state. I mean, it really, I don't know. I mean, it's tough. Maybe where we completely lose Dante, but that's certainly what he believes. Section 14 is extremely interesting. Again, I'm not always following Dante's logic here of his overall argument, which is really that we should have a single world government. But two ideas here, which are, I think, extremely interesting. And again, interesting in themselves, but also interesting as we move along to more modern ways of thinking about politics and government. The one is that this idea, as he says in the beginning, it is better that what can be done by one should be done by one, not by many, which is really an argument for kingship or emperorship or monarchy. That I suppose something done by many would be like a republic, where you have a legislative authority like the U.S. Congress, which is the many that make the laws, and then you have other branches of government. You have the executive, the presidency, you have the courts. And the whole idea in a republic is that the work of government should be done by many, not by one. Dante takes the opposite position. If something can be done by one, it should be done by one because it will be done better. And that is, in politics, if you are a Democrat, believe in democracy, if you believe in the idea of a republic, you don't believe that. But I think in a lot of areas of life, people do believe that. That too many cooks spoil the broth or something like that. So it's not a dead idea by any means, I think. But also this idea towards the middle of page 20, which is something I've mentioned before. Dante believes there should be world government, but there shouldn't be one ruler making all the decisions for everybody all the time, which I'm glad to see because that would be ridiculously impractical. If you look into what he says here in the beginning of in the middle of the page, he says, thus nations, states, and cities have their own internal concerns, which require special laws. For law is a rule to guide our lives. And then he mentions people who live in the north where it's cold, people who live in the south where it's hot. And, he says, that those people need to make adjustments to their lives to make their lives good because they live in different conditions. So he says down here, world government, on the other hand, must be understood in the sense that it governs mankind on the basis of what all have in common, and that by a common law it leads all towards peace. This common norm or law should be received by local governments in the same way that practical intelligence and action receives its major premises from the speculative intellect. Like he's thinking, again, like a medieval thinker like Thomas Aquinas, that there are common notions, there are basic principles of goodness, justice, truth, and then there's the application of them to particular situations. I think what he's thinking of is that a world government would stand for those basic common principles that we all share, supposedly, but that localities, nations, communities should have the freedom to adjust them to how they should be properly applied. For instance, we're all committed to justice. We're all committed to fairness. And even Dante would say we're all committed to equality. Those are things we're all committed to. But how those things are actually to be applied in particular situations has to be left up to the locality. So it is really not so crazy, this idea of a world government, because it would have to be elastic to a certain extent. It would have to leave room for local decision making, which makes it maybe not completely plausible, this idea of world government, but at least more reasonable. Finally, looking at the last parts of this reading, looking at section 15, it's an interesting idea, and again, very medieval, very, very Middle Ages, very Catholic, frankly. The idea that everything should fit together into a whole. Everything, even though there's diversity, it's diversity in unity, which is really, I would say, the medieval Catholic idea that the world is diverse, but it's unified by things. Mankind, humankind, I should say, is diverse, but it's unified by certain things, which I would say is the big controversy of our time, whether there is something that draws human beings as a species together into a common life. I think that a lot of people would deny that, and for good reason. But I don't know. I think it's a big controversy. But in any case, I mean, you can see where he's going. A unified humankind is better than one that is not unified. Of course, it'd be unity in diversity and diversity in that unity, but it would still be a unification, or what he calls concord and peace. Yeah. He says, with this in mind, we can now proceed to our argument in behalf of our proposition as follows. All concord depends on unity in wills. The best state of mankind is a kind of concord, an agreement, like we're all for this, basic ideas, like we're all for justice, we're all for peace, we're all for equality. For as a man is in excellent health when he enjoys concord in soul and body, and similarly a family, city, or state, so mankind as a whole. Very, very big analogy in medieval thinking between society and the human body. Just as all the parts of the human body, although they're different, work together for the health of the whole, so all the individuals and all the different sorts of groups within society, although they're different, should all work towards the common goal. Therefore, the well-being of mankind depends on the unity of its wills, but this is possible only if there is a single dominant will, which directs all others towards unity. That's really an argument for kingship. I don't know. I don't know. It's so different from the kind of thinking that we modern people have. But there are still people who are monarchists in our world. There are still people who believe this. I mean, there's still people in different parts of the world who believe in a supreme ruler. There are countries that are still monarchies. There are countries that still have, based on theological premises, a supreme ruler. And certainly a country like Russia right now, in the age of Putin, is such a country. They have a supreme ruler, right, who basically runs the country as his personal possession almost. I think that maybe Trump was wanted that. Trump came from a business world where he was used to having this sort of dictatorial control, and then he ran into the American constitutional system where he didn't have it, and he couldn't figure out why people weren't just doing whatever he said. So the idea is alive. And for Dante, he believes it's a healthy, good idea, whereas most, I say, at least again, if you come from a democratic Republican country that's committed to democracy and the idea of a republic, you usually see this as a bad thing. It's just someone having absolute power. And finally, this is really interesting. The last part of Uganda China, this is a Christian view, Christian medieval view. He says the incarnation of Christ during the Augustan Empire, when there prevailed a maximum of world peace, bears witness that these principles are divine, and the miseries which have overtaken man since he departed from that golden age likewise bear witness. This is ending with this really interesting thing. That he's basically saying, that Christ appeared, Jesus was born during the age of Augustus, when the Roman Empire was either at its height or moving towards its height of unified empire. Obviously a fairly small part of the globe as a whole, but to their minds, the Roman Empire was like the world, and Dante, again, as I said before, the memory of Rome, although it's long gone, the empire, but the language of Latin is still there. Classical learning is still there as an ideal. He's remembering the Roman Empire and thinking that was the golden age, when millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people were unified under a single government, as opposed to the Italy that Dante lives in, which is fractured, which is made up of petty little kingdoms and then these little republics like Venice and Florence, but with all this strife. He wants unity. He wants peace. And we'll see that in our next reading. Machiavelli, another Italian of a couple hundred years later, a Renaissance Italian as opposed to a medieval Italian, has the same sort of thing. I mean, he sees his own land. Italy is not yet a country. Italy is a collection of places, not yet unified. Italy wouldn't be unified as a country until the 1860s. But Dante sees this, or Machiavelli sees this as a great tragedy. Italy should be unified. It's a common culture, more or less common language, although, of course, that's a big issue, different languages within Italy, whole history of that. So really, I would say, maybe a tough read in some ways, but really, really interesting work and a really interesting glimpse into the medieval mind and how it thinks of politics and social life.